Summer Davos in Tianjin this year is dealing with the topic shaping innovative societies in the fourth industrial revolution. During the meeting, policymakers and business leaders will primarily focus on topics such as creating opportunities for developing countries to leap forward with revolutionary technologies, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, while mitigating potential risks associated with them.
More than 2,000 participants from over 100 countries are taking part in this three-day Summer Davos in Tianjin. The theme of this year's meeting is Shaping Innovative Societies in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's a transformation powered by new technologies, including artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and gene editing. It's already impacting societies, economies, and geopolitical landscapes. At the opening ceremony, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang stressed the significance of this new industrial revolution.
A new round of industrial revolution has come into being in the age of globalization. We have gone through several rounds of industrial revolutions, and they have all boosted the globalization of trade. And this new round of industrial revolution has come into being against the backdrop of globalization at a time when mankind is facing new challenges and has to come up with new wisdom to respond to these new challenges.
2018 marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. Premier Li once again insisted that China will continue to deeply reform and open the economy.
For more discussion on this year's Summer Davos Forum, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, the Dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. And also in Hong Kong, we have Edward Xie, who is the Chairman and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. In New York, we are joined by Max Wolf, Professor of Economics with New School University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, Professor Wolf, of course, that has been a key phrase being repeated once and again. But the question really is, do we really know the meaning of it? Is it really likely to be a real industrial revolution?
I think we do know it really is revolutionary. After all, the definitive phrase of this epoch is disruption, and disruption is at least the miniature format of revolution. I suppose you have to disrupt something a certain number of times to get it to revolve fully 360 degrees. But I think we know that our lives, our wealth, our communication, our archival base of knowledge has been digitized, has been distributed by and across the mobile web, and maybe even moving into blockchain. So I think it's fair to say that at this point we are in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution, even though we have no idea what the full consequence or net impact will be, because we're still right sort of smack in the middle of this process.
Professor Liu, dominance of technologies, of course, is a huge topic these days. The one that is really grasping the fundamental technologies are really the one that is going to say a word and shakes the world, in fact. But how do you see this apparent prosperity among economies around the world and the fundamental strength of economy vis-à-vis its relations with some of the most important technologies in the world?
Yes, it is really those forward-looking technologies, which is also termed as emerging industries, that are really going to dominate the productivity. And also now with the help of Internet or Internet of Things, with artificial intelligence, you are really weaving a big web where, whether you are really fishing or whether you are being fished. So that's really make a lot of difference. And that's going to create a tremendous amount of change in terms of wealth distribution and also power distribution between different circles of the classes, and also between even different nations.
But, having said all of this, Professor Wolf, we have seen some technologies have been overplayed over the past few years. Let's just say VR. You can see the frequency of using those phrases earlier was much more than what it is today. Obviously, today it's more about AI, artificial intelligence, And it is nothing secretive, in fact, about artificial intelligence because it has enjoyed its ups and downs over the past 5 decades. So what we are having probably is only one of those stages in its development. And yet there are so many myths and also fascination about this technology. Once again, my question to you is, when are we going to be grounded about applications of technologies, about really what technologies can create the real world?
Yeah, so we've gotten into an unfortunate cycle, and I think really became very pronounced around the turn of the millennium, so around the year 2000, in which the hype cycle on new technology is so large that it's almost guaranteed to be later than we expected and almost disappointing or a little bit anticlimactic when it arrives. That being said, I think eventually these things really do smack into the way we live our lives and make profound changes. So if we can think back to 18 years ago, basically now, to the first big tech bubble, basically there was this notion that everybody was going to do everything on a smartphone or a cell phone at the time. We didn't even have the phrase smartphone, and that was considered kind of crazy. But then by 2007, a few years after the first tech wreck, we got the iPhone and we started getting the Samsung products and all these smartphones, and all of a sudden that futuristic crazy talk from 1999 was an everyday reality in 2009. So the cycle from hype, which is a real problem, to reality has gone from decades to in some cases months. And I do think we have had the change, but I think the truth is technology doesn't solve social problems. Concerted effort does, and we've gotten to a bad habit of hoping our technologies will solve our inequality and our climate change and our democracy and other issues around the world, and it doesn't work, right? So technology is a potential way to enhance productivity. It doesn't solve social problems.
That's right. But on the other hand, Mr. Xie, we see platform economies. You remember those? That has been the phrase that's mentioned by many, and yet we have seen some of those are really running into problems. Facebook, for example, Uber, for example, you have some equivalent of that in China as well, and some of the other economies. Big question marks about whether these formats are really likely to work.
In the advance of technology, there's always some trial and errors, right? So in some cases, advances will be made, and in some cases, perhaps you'll run into some problem. It's just the nature when the new technology is being introduced in the commercial application. We're going to see more collaboration. We're going to need people or companies to work with other companies or people in order to construct even more innovations. So ecosystem or platform, in my view, will further manifest themselves in the future with the new way of technology.
Professor Liu, your thoughts?
Having said that, the technology is really calling for decentralization of power, but in the meantime, further integrity in the same place. So coordination around the globe, and also it's going to reshape the entire global supply chain. So whether that's going to pass, number one, ethical test. The other is really the practical test or economic test. So a lot of the newborn stuff are really there to to take some time for people to talk about and then to approve. That's going to really contribute to the real well-being of human society.
But Professor Wolf, it is well known that on the one hand, you got technologies that are supposed to transcend borders. On the other hand, you got protectionism running high in some countries, including the United States. You want to have I mean, your president wants to have a wall even built between Mexico and the United States. I want to have tariffs, which has been the tool used decades ago between economies. So how do you think this conflict between the apparent technological liftoff of the world vis-a-vis the coming back of some of the old ideas of protectionism?
Great moments of progress always encounter opponents of progress. There are always people who are terrified or fear that the old order will be washed away by the new capability, and that they will be washed away with the old order, right? So there are always forces that oppose the progress of history. So in each effort, each great sort of step forward, there have always been those who tried to hold back, pull back, or push back. And that can be quite a problem. And I think we see that again here, which is the world is being reshaped by new technologies and new patterns of trade and new areas of wealth and power. And there are folks who fear that change and oppose it. Sadly, the U.S. president and some around him may be one of those folks right now. But I think the basic momentum for change ultimately wins.
Well, it's easier said than done, isn't it, Professor Wolf? I mean, if you look at history, everything seems so simple. Just a piece of fact, and yet it was through enormous amount of struggle and zigzagging, eventually things happened. And therefore, Professor Wolf, do you think there's likely to be in a way, utmost battle in the very near or immediate future that we're likely to see the conflict between technologies, or technology that has to transcend borders, and protectionism? What is likely to be, and how can we prepare if there's any way to do that?
So it's a great question. I think, sadly, the battle has already begun, right? I think probably been raging a little bit for a while and very intensely for over a year or so now. I do think that the forces and the institutions and individuals and the centers that are pushing forward for an even more integrated, even more open world will probably win, but it's never guaranteed, and it's hard. There's a great quote from Martin Luther King, American leader here, that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of the world economy is also long, and it bends toward progress, but it's a slow bend, and it can be an arduous, long path.
Mr. Xie, are you ready for that slow bend and arduous task?
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I believe that, you know, the fourth industrial revolution is actually based on technology that will transcend national borders, and therefore is actually catering for the parts of the world which will really want to go for more globalization and multilateralism. I believe that, you know, whoever country who want to sort of be single lateralism, is gonna close themselves off to the rest of the world, and therefore will not benefit from the economic or technological advance that we'll be seeing in the next generation. So I think logic, you know, the logic would say is going to sway the world back to hopefully a more globalized world.
I see. Professor Liu, on the other hand, you did see some economies are taking advantage of the latest development. The mobile pay you mentioned earlier, Professor Liu, of course, is a good example. Many of the developing and emerging economies are having this opportunity to so-called leapfrog, but the possibility of doing the leapfrog vis-a-vis the securities that economies has to guarantee in order to enjoy this leapfrog at the same time is also a crucial issue.
Absolutely, because this fourth industrial revolution is really a far more complicated system as compared with the previous one. So it needs, you know, the precise design and also better coordination, which cannot really be realized even within one single country. So therefore, the challenge there, whether you know, those developing countries, they are you know, seeing this, but whether they are ready, have they really done the right type of homework? China is really moving very fast. We are talking about the 5G technology. We talk about AI, the big data, etc. But we still have to be very cautious when we come back to the ZTE case. We realize that we haven't done a very solid fundamental work dealing with the chips. So therefore, it really requires forward-looking but also practical steps.
Professor Wolf, it seems that Mr. Xie is trying to suggest, on the one hand, we're still not really taking great advantage of the technologies available for the possible future education. On the other hand, there is a lacking behind the so-called educational system we're having right now, and the way we teach, the way we learn, compared to where the technologies is already leading to us. Obviously, it takes a lot of work, but we didn't see much hope at all. So the question really is, who will be the winner as a result? Or we are all going to be losers eventually?
I do think there's a bit of a particular clash, as someone who works in the education business as well, which is part of what's made for an elite education, and part of what educators and education administrators have prided themselves on is adherence to tradition. And I think in moments of particularly radical and extensive change, like in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, that very sort of tradition and adherence to tradition, which is part of higher education, and education needs to be relaxed, and so that education can be not just doing what it thinks is good, but doing what really helps build the society, both in terms of new productivity, but also keep the social bonds strong enough that the society doesn't collapse, because social collapse undermines productivity gains pretty quickly.
You argue about the educational system should be much more quote-unquote relaxed, but some wonder whether the legal system should also be more relaxed or further adjusted. Professor Liu, here is an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, the legal system is not capable to handle with the latest development related to technologies. On the other hand, you also see that some kinds of adjustment to the legal system, some wonder whether it's leaving enough space for the new economies to take off, for them to be able to test the faults, as they say. Professor Liu, always a delicate balance.
You know, we have to know whether, you know, the technology, where it is generic, when it's really generic, whether they are being used in an ethical manner. So that really, you know, invites the law into the place to sanction certain behavior. For example, the protection of privacy is taking on a new paradigm.
It seems that every one of you gentlemen tonight has become a philosopher in a way. Mr. Xie, what about that? How much can you bear about the steps backward before the step forward takes place?
Well, I agree with the assessment of Professor Wolf. I think, you know, as we try to advance the technology, you know, there's some areas that we have to take a step backwards, but at the same time, the logic or the vitality of sort of technological advances, in my view, will ultimately make more sense, because, you know, we need to make progresses, and technology is going to, you know, help us to do that. So whatever artificial barriers that will be erected in the meantime, you know, some of them will be barriers, but many of them will not become barriers. So overall speaking, I think I agree. You know, we're probably going to take some backwards a little bit, but at the same time, we're going to make big strides going forward in some other ways. So overall speaking, I think we're going to see a lot of progress.
Okay, before we go, final question for every one of you. If there's anything about the Fourth Industrial Revolution that you are looking for, what exactly is it? Not being a philosopher, but rather being a person in the society, what exactly are you thinking? Professor Wolf, you go first.
Yeah, I'm looking for an international governance on cyber policy and rights online, because I don't think single nation states can do that very well.
All right, Mr. Xie?
I'm hoping that technology is going to, you know, help us to have a better life, in particular, perhaps in extending the human lifetime, but also in particular in improving our health standards.
Last but not least, Professor Liu, your wish, though.
Well, I wish that the combination of information together with biotechnology can extend your life expectancy, and also to raise the quality of life for everybody.
Oh, it seems that we all want longevity, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. I really appreciate it. Liu Baocheng, Edward Xie, and Max Wolf.